everyone. Thank you for joining us at Square Books tonight. We're going to be speaking with Charles Baxter, who has been called the national treasure by some people, and I would agree. But I also like to remind you about one upcoming event we have tomorrow night. Denise Kiernan will be here. She's got a new book called We Gather Together, which is basically a history of how Thanksgiving holiday was created. Very fascinating. She's an old friend of Square Books. In fact, a few years ago, her book, The Girls of Atomic City, was the common read for the freshman class at the University of Mississippi. So she's visited us in Oxford several times. And she will be in conversation with Kelly Aucoin, whom some of you may know from the show Billions, where he plays Dollar Bill. And I promise you that he is, in reality, much nicer than the amoral character he is on that show. So that is 5 o'clock Central Time tomorrow night. And also, I'd like to remind you before we begin, because tonight's novel is The Sun Collective, and we do have signed book plates for that, which you can order through Square Books or by phone, either way. So our great pleasure to have Charles Baxter with us tonight. And in interest of full disclosure, I have to tell you that Charlie and I lived in the same neighborhood in Ann Arbor for many years, by around Almendinger Park, which was the setting, of course, for Feast of Love. So we're very personally happy for me to have him with us tonight. So Charlie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
And for people who don't know, the Sun Collective just released yesterday. It's a new novel. It's Charlie's sixth. It involves an elderly couple whose son has disappeared and they're searching for him. The son is an upcoming actor, but he is searching for his own identity rather than the roles he's played. And there's a young woman who's a little bored with life and is looking for purpose. And eventually they all meet through a Sun Collective, which is a group of people who want to be politically active, want to change the world, but don't seem to be able to agree on an agenda. And eventually all of these quests will coalesce. And that's as far as I'm going, because we're not any spoilers on this. So Charlie, what's it like doing a book tour in 2020? I mean, must be like stepping through the looking glass.
Well, it is, of course. And the odd feature about it is that usually when I go into a bookstore and I begin talking about a book, I can actually see the audience. And in this case, of course, I can't. All I can see is my computer screen. So I can't see how anybody is reacting to anything that I say. So you know, it's manageable. I think we're all of us are finding different ways of doing activities that we once took for granted. And I think this isn't any stranger than much of the rest of the day that I pass. I'm not seeing my relatives generally. I'm not going to movies, I'm not going to plays, I'm not going to concerts. So just accommodating myself to the screen it's not so bad.
Well, we'd rather have you in Oxford with us, but this will have to do. You've done 6 novels, also 6 short story collections, 3 poetry collections, 2 essay collections. So you've not only been prolific, but versatile. But this is your first novel that is set in Minneapolis. And you're originally from the Twin Cities, and you moved back there, about 18 years ago, I believe.
Yes.
It took a long time to adjust to the changes in culture and geography of the city that you knew as a youngster and to what it has become.
Yes, very much so. The city that I left is not very much like the city that I came back to. And having said that, neither the city that I grew up in or the city that I came back to 18 years ago is like the city as it is now. I don't know where your viewers may be living, but Minneapolis in some ways now is very much like a ghost town. Uh, People are not coming down to offices. Many of the buildings downtown are boarded up, uh, partly because of the troubles in the city after the George Floyd murder. Uh, so I have had, yeah, I've had to accustom myself to a place that is both familiar and newly strange. And you know, I like that. I basically, everything that I have to do in the city, I walk to. And so I run into a lot of people. You and I were talking about this a few minutes ago.
Well, you mentioned the death of George Floyd. Anybody reading your manuscript would have thought that you must be prescient. Did you have to do any adjustments in rewriting once Mr. Floyd was killed and the aftermath?
No, the book was already in production by that time. So I was unable to change anything. And I think there's a danger anyhow in trying to make a novel so relevant to the press of daily events that you alter what the shape of the book really should be. I mean, it really was enough for me to try to give the reader a sense of what it has felt like to live in the United States for the past 5 years. And I found that a lot of the techniques of realism were only of limited value to me. We can talk more about that, but I mean, the quick answer to your question is no. I didn't change the book at all following the George Floyd death.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about the changes in Minneapolis. Was that change in culture what really stimulated you to finally set a novel in the Twin Cities?
I think so. Though I have to say that every writer usually finds his or her or their imagination's home where you feel inclined to daydream, and also where you have a feeling of authority over the settings and the scenes that you're writing. You and I both know Stuart Dybek, whose fiction almost invariably has been set in Chicago. William Maxwell's fiction, at least his first 3 or 4 novels, took place in a small town in central Illinois. When I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I wrote about Ann Arbor, Michigan, or a kind of imaginary town I had invented called Five Oaks. But now that I'm here, now that I'm in Minneapolis, I just think about Minneapolis and I think about the kinds of people who live here. And I also think a lot, I have thought a lot about the political history of this city, which in the 1930s had warring factions of communists, mostly in the truck drivers union. They were, for the most part, followers of Leon Trotsky, and a very strong fascist element in the city in and around a group called the Silver Shirts. And the political history of the city affected or bled into the kind of story I was telling.
I was going to ask you that actually, that you think that Minneapolis has almost come full circle in the course of 90 years because it was so radical during the Depression years.
Absolutely. And there are I shouldn't say monuments, but remembrances around the city of what happened here, particularly in 1936 when the truckers union struck. And I think there were many men wounded and at least 4 killed. There was warfare in the streets. And that warfare led to what was then called the Farmer Labor Party. And in 1948, the Farmer Labor Party merged with the Democratic Party, so that if you're a Democrat in Minneapolis, you're not, you can't say that I'm a member of the Democratic Party. You're a member of the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. It's still called that here.
But we all learned something new tonight.
Amy Klobuchar is a representative of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party of Minnesota.
I knew her dad, by the way.
He was a writer.
Yeah,
he was a writer. He was
Star Tribune. He was a sports writer.
That's right. He was a columnist for the Minneapolis paper.
Yeah. Well, in terms of like your work, and especially Sun Collective now, where the novels, and you talk about the societies, but there's always been a strong social and spiritual content inside of all of your books. Do you think that sometimes, because you are such a craftsman with the language, that people will lose sight of that because they get caught up in the characters and in the story?
Well, I don't want to be known as a writer who writes books in order to make a point. I think that for me, and of course, not every writer feels this, but for me, the first task of the writer is to construct a story that will take the reader away to a kind of hypothetical world that is like ours, but is not entirely like ours. That is also a construction. So, you know, when my novel begins, and I'm not, I think, giving away anything here, the main character, a man named Harry Brettigan, is riding the light rail out to the Mall of America, which in the novel is called the Utopia Mall. And a strange man sits down next to him and gives him what he calls a cure for affliction. This particular cure is one that I discovered was a folklore cure for people who were suffering through the 1918 flu epidemic, by the way. And the stranger also says that in French Canadian folklore, there's a figure called Notre Seigneur en Pauvre, who is our Lord in rags, and who may sooner or later come to you and ask you for help, ask you for money, ask you for shelter, ask you for clothes, and it's a spot quiz for your salvation. The reason I put that in at the beginning was that I wanted the sense of social necessity. That is, what are we going to do about the poor people in our midst, to be both a social question and kind of a spiritual, religious one. And that's where the novel starts. And if the reader can keep his or her or their eye on those matters, fine. If you just get swept up by the story, that's fine too.
No, I've always wondered about that. I especially thought it applied to like Saul and Patsy, which is much more than a novel about a marriage. But it's interesting that you talk about the meeting on the train I understand that you have used conversations you had with homeless people on public transportation and actually transcribed them right into the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. I was standing on the platform at Fifth and Hennepin in Minneapolis. It was 3 or 4 winters ago. And a guy came up to me and asked me for some money. He said, "Buddy, can you spare a buck for a beer?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess so. Does it have to be a beer?" And he said, "Yeah, it does." And we got to talking, and I asked him, "Where do you sleep at night?" And he said, I sleep on this train. They don't kick you off. I get on the train and I sleep on the train all night." And I said, "Well, what about the shelters?" He said, "I don't like to go to those places." And I asked him why not. He said, "Oh, they're full of creeps. And besides," he said, "they won't let me in." "Why not?" I said. And he said, "Because I'm a drunk." And I said, "Well, why not stop drinking just before you want to get into the shelter?" And he said, "I can't do that." And I said, well, why can't you?" And he said, "Because I'm crazy." And I was so, I don't know, I was moved, and um, I'm really struggling to find I was moved by it, and uh, really touched. And I went home and I wrote down what he and I had said. And there was another guy I met, I think at a bus stop, and we got to talking. He was headed out, I think, to the VA hospital. And he started talking about how after he got back from Afghanistan, he had started to have trouble with his mind. And again, we got to talking, and I said, "Well, what happened to you over there?" And he said, "I got into hand-to-hand combat with an Afghan soldier, and his sweat fell into my mouth, and I haven't been in my right mind since then."
That is powerful.
Yeah, yeah. And that went into the book too.
Well, you do such an amazing job with language. I'm going to read our audience just one sentence to give them an idea. This is from Dream Collective, from the Sun Collective. "Her dreams bored her. They looked like previews of coming attractions that never arrived." That amazes me. Every word works. But the question is, how much work does it take for you? Like, what do you think is the amount of time to even get one good page done?
Uh, the answer to that is different for every writer. This book is probably the product of 5 years work. And most of the time, when I sit down in the morning to start writing, I have no expectations, which is to say that if I get one paragraph written, I think, great, I got one paragraph written. I spend all morning or I spend all day on that paragraph. So be it. When I started the book, I thought, first of all, I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know what the plot was going to be. I wasn't sure where it was going. And I thought, I'm in my late 60s now. Um, there are no deadlines. I can take as long with this thing as I want to. It may be that I'll never finish it. Some of my friends asked me, "Well, what are you working on?" I said, "I'm working on a novel that I don't think I'll ever finish. I think it's going to take me the rest of my life to write this book." But it didn't. It took me 5 years. And I only stopped writing it because I could see that it was headed toward what we used to call a climactic moment. Uh, I don't know if that answers your question, Bill. There's some days when you find that you can write a couple of pages and they're all pretty much okay. And other days when, one or two sentences seem like a triumph.
Well, you are also well known as a teacher. In fact, you just recently retired from the University of Minnesota. Is there like one major dictum that you use for your students, as writers, to something for them to attain, or something to strive for, or something to take the whole profession of writing into, a compact area?
Well, one of the things that I try to say to them is that our task is to make these imagined worlds, these fictional worlds, both truthful and beautiful, and to make the scenes and the stories as vivid as possible so that when the reader closes the book isn't finished with the reader. It goes on living in that person's head. It's as if the force of the imagination, and I think this is true in all of the arts, the force of the imagination goes from the writer into the book and then from the book into the mind of the reader. And I think it's a calling. I won't say that it's sacred, but I think it's a serious human enterprise to pass on these stories, because I think at its best, fiction enlarges our capacity for empathy.
Well, I remember years ago, you wrote an essay, I think it was in Burning Down the House, that poets have more fun than novelists. Do you still subscribe to that notion?
I got into a lot of trouble.
Read that essay.
Yeah, I got into a lot of trouble with my friends, the poets, over that essay. The thing that I said in that essay that the poets never forgave me for was that poets are ideal friends because they have to figure out ways of filling up the 23 and a half hours of the day when they're not writing. Most poets, I claimed, only work for half an hour a day. But in the teaching that I've done, I try not to sermonize. I try to give my students some of the most practical advice that I can. I talk a lot about request moments. I talk a lot about one-way gates, about setting the story clock, about having volatile characters whom I call Captain Happen, acute versus chronic tension, all of these sort of technical matters that finally constitute the tools in any writer's toolbox. I mean, it's very good to go on and say writing is a precious thing, and writing fiction is a great calling. But you have to talk about the nuts and bolts too. Otherwise, you're not going to be of any help to anybody.
Well, you have always put some personal notes in books, like, for instance, Charlie Baxter wandering around Almendinger Park.
Yeah.
But Brettigan, the elderly gentleman in Sun Collective, is a retired structural engineer and bridge designer.
Mm-hmm.
Happens to be the profession of your son, Daniel.
Yes.
The book is dedicated.
Yes.
Is that sort of like you doing a Hitchcock cameo in one of his movies, having a little fun with that? Well,
yes and no. When I saw the direction that the novel was taking, I thought that the Sun Collective, this group of neighborhood progressives who were opening up a free store, who had a co-op, who wanted to open a co-op bank, I thought, what if some of the members of this group didn't believe in small improvements and instead wanted to resort to what one of them calls violence, termite violence. And I thought, it's just possible that one of them might want to blow up a bridge. People in Minneapolis think about bridges a lot because the Interstate 35 bridge, as you may know or remember, collapsed here in Minneapolis about 12 or 13 years ago. And when I began to see that there might be a destruction of a bridge, I called my son and I said, what would it take to bring a bridge down? And he said, Dad, you don't want to do it. you don't want to do it. I said, I'm not going to do it, actually. I'm just thinking about it as a possible plot point. And he said, okay, let me explain it to you, which he did. But there are two paragraphs, speaking of Hitchcock appearances, there are two paragraphs in the book that he wrote. I didn't write them, he wrote them. And one of them, I know you don't really want authors to read, but he closed his eyes and thought of a bridge he would design for her, for all of them. It would be a pedestrian bridge formed by a slender and heavily post-tensioned concrete deck, the cables anchored to stiff foundations at either end. A stress ribbon bridge would have the shape of gently sloping catenary curves, not unlike the rope pedestrian suspension bridges that humanity had been building since prehistory. The ribbon bridge that Brettigan saw in his imagination would be well suited to a river. He saw all of them, the shadows, crossing over on his bridge to rest in the shade of the trees.
Bless Daniel.
Well, it's not all Daniel. The final sentence is mine,
You got
and it's actually a quote. Your historically minded audience members may remember that Stonewall Jackson's dying words were, "Let us cross the river. Let us cross the river, and rest in the shade of the trees."
Then obviously Daniel came to that profession with a natural talent. As I remember it, when you did shadow play, which by the way, people should read, he created a map of Five Oaks.
You're absolutely right. And the strange thing is I had forgotten about that until you reminded me of it just now. Yeah, that's right. I had created this small city. It's a little bit like Ann Arbor or Bay City, Michigan, or Saginaw. And I was getting a little confused about where things were in the city. And because Daniel, my son, was a very good drafts person, he could draw anything. He said, I'll make you a map of it. So I had this map that my son had drawn next to me on the desk, which I could consult whenever I got confused about where things were.
You know, I remember that so well. You know, that's almost 30 years ago, actually.
That's right.
For those of you who have not read Shadow Play, please go make the effort. Spectacular, special book. I think Sandy has some questions for us.
Hello. I have one question right now. So if you have more questions, please go ahead and start submitting them.
Okay,
The audience would like to know what both of you are currently reading.
Should I start?
go ahead,
Sure.
Charlie.
Um, I don't mean to make this a long answer, but if you walk outside my building and walk down the Nicollet Mall, you will see many businesses that have been boarded up because in the riots following the George Floyd death, some of the crowds came downtown. And I thought, I want to know more about the psychology of crowds. There's an amazing nonfiction book by a writer named Elias Canetti. The book was originally written in German, and it's called Crowds and Power. And I recommend it to everyone. Let's see, this is another book I've been reading, Time of the Magicians. 4 philosophers writing in Germany during the Weimar era. Absolutely fascinating book. My third book is Emmanuel Carrère, a French writer, a nonfiction book called Lives Other Than My Own. Beautiful book, beautiful book.
Well, personally, what I'm reading right now is a novel that won't even come out until August. It's called Damnation Spring. It's a debut novel set in the Pacific logging area. About 100 and some pages done. And I think it's going to be very well received book when it does come out.
Mhm.
Okay. This is a question for Bill. Bill, do you have any funny stories about when you and Charles were neighbors?
I think we'll use the Fifth Amendment on that.
You can't do that to the people, Bill. They want to know.
You know, in today's very litigious world, probably the best thing to do.
Okay, fair enough. Well, Bill, I don't have any more questions. Do you have any more questions for Charles?
I do actually. When we talked a little bit about some of the older novels, and Charlie's been with the same editor, Dan Frank, for many, many years, ever since he did the short story collection Believers. Is it an advantage, do you think, for a writer to be able to maintain a relationship with the same editor?
Absolutely. And I am just one of the luckiest writers in the world. And I think many of the writers who have worked with Dan feel this way. The first and probably the most important quality that needs to exist between a writer and his or her or their editor is trust. And if Dan says something to me about my novel, I trust that he means it, and 99% of the time, I trust that he is right. And I can give you, I think, 2 examples of this. In this book, there is a final chapter with Brettigan riding, as it turns out for the last time, on the light rail in Minneapolis. The chapter right before that one consists of a dialogue between, between Brettigan's wife, Alma, and the dog and the cat in the household. And that chapter had been the last one I wrote and had placed at the end of the book. And Dan said, you have to switch them over. You have to reverse the order. And the minute he said that, I thought, yes, you're right. The other thing about this novel is that the draft I turned into him was about 100 pages longer. And he said to me after reading it, well, I like it, but there are too many stories in it. There are too many characters who stop the flow of the plot and start to tell stories. There still are some of those characters. There's a dinner party where Alma begins to talk about a man that she knew in college and after college. But when Dan told me, you've got to cut out some of these stories, I thought, yeah, you're right. And so whatever I felt about the book was altered by the way he thought about it. Because in some ways, an editor should be your closest collaborator. If you don't trust the editor and the editor doesn't have respect for you, you're both in trouble.
And by the way, people, when you get to the Sun Collective, Harry and Alma Brettigan's dog and cat, the names of them are taken from The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, which is a lovely little touch. And I read that book also. Charlie and I were speaking earlier about how during the COVID, you have plenty of time to read all those books you couldn't get to in the past.
That's right.
I do have a new question. What are you planning on writing next, Charles?
I have one last book of essays under contract to Grey Wolf. It's called Wonderlands, Essays on the Life of Fiction. And these are essays that some of the essays are autobiographical, or autobiographical also in relation to the reading that I've done. And some of the essays are about ideas that I have been employing or talking about in my workshops for fiction writers, particularly something that I've come to call the request moment. That is when one character in a story or a novel turns to another character and says, there's something I want you to do. And then there's a condition. If you are really my friend, or if you really love me, or if you're, let's say, a real man, this is the kind of dare that men or women sometimes direct in the direction of men, you'll do this for me. So there's the request, there's the condition, and then there's the story clock. That is, there's something I want you to do, and if you really love me, you'll do it for me. And by the way, I want you to do it by tomorrow. And all of these matters create a sense of urgency in the story, even if the person who has gotten the request doesn't do it. And so that essay is going into the book. I have an essay on the subject of dramatic imagery, an essay about lush styles, an essay about volatile characters whom I call Captain Happen. And there's also a personal essay about the time I was in a airport limousine on the way to the San Francisco airport, and the driver was lecturing me about what happens in hell, at which point it was raining. He lost control of the limousine. We started to fishtail. We went off the road and we went tumbling. The car went end over end down the hill. I have an essay about that. These are all nonfiction essays. It'll be out in 2022.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. I can't wait to read that. So that is our time, folks. I'd like to thank Charles and Bill so much for being here today and for such thoughtful questions. This was a really, really fascinating discussion. I'm so glad we got to hear it.
Well, thank you to you and to Square Books for sponsoring this. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Bill.
No, thank you, Charlie. Hopefully the next time you can join us in Oxford. You haven't been here for a couple of years.
No, I haven't been there for a while. That's right. Love to come back.
We're waiting.
Yeah, we'll get to see you soon. A reminder, you can get copies of The Sun Collective with the signed book plate from our website, that's squarebooks.com. And we hope you'll join us tomorrow for Denise Kiernan's event. But that's all from us. So thanks everybody so much.